Hey guys, welcome back to Mondays at the Museum. I'm Carrie and I'm here at the Anna Bemis Palmer Museum in York, Nebraska. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the Spanish-American War. In April of 2023, we actually hit the 125th anniversary of the Spanish-American War, which was fought in 1898. For those of you that don't know, our founder, Anna Bemis Palmer, was married to Orlando Gray Palmer, who was a first sergeant in the Oklahoma Rough Riders, Troop D, 1st U.S. Cavalry, and his unit went to Cuba to fight in the Spanish-American War. So why am I talking about this today? Well, a big part of that is tomorrow, July 25th, 125 years ago, we invaded Puerto Rico as part of that very same war. So here's a little bit of the timeline of sorts. The Americans officially joined the Spanish-American War in April of 1898, but tensions were high there in Cuba way before then. Basically, rebellion started in Cuba in 1895. At the time, it was a Spanish colony, and they decided that Spain was cruel and they didn't want to be under their thumb anymore, so they started a rebellion and they stood up for themselves, and the word started to spread. Once it made American newspapers, that's all anybody wanted to talk about, and the press worked everybody up about it and wanted the Americans to go join in the war and defend the Cubans from the atrocities that Spain was committing on them. But McKinley was president and he didn't want to go to war. He was not for that, and he held off and he held off and he held off. And then the Spanish ambassador supposedly said some not so nice things about McKinley, and suddenly I'm sending a warship. So he sent the USS Maine. He launched the warship down to Cuba, and while floating in the Havana harbor, the USS Maine exploded. Now, if you do any research on this, you're going to hear one of two things. You're either going to hear it was an accident, or you're going to hear Spain blew it up. To this day, we don't know what happened. It could have been an accident. It could have been, targeted, completely sabotaged. But remember how I was talking about the press was working everybody up? Imagine what they did with that story. It became the huge national headline, and basically there was no talk of an accident at all. McKinley, pressures became too high for him, and he officially declared war. The slogan became, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." Catchy, I know, right? Spain knew that they couldn't defeat the US, but they decided they wanted to go down fighting because it was dishonorable to surrender immediately. Americans sent troops to the east, to Cuba, and to the west, in the Philippines. And as part of the Philippines, there was a big, huge, giant battle called the Battle of Manila Bay, where Commodore George Dewey led the charge and reportedly exclaimed, "You may fire when ready, Gridley." The Americans completely decimated the Spanish fleet. It wasn't even close. However, Dewey didn't have enough manpower to take the actual city of Manila, so they were kind of at a standstill until 15,000 troops showed up in late July to back them up. Because Spain was unwilling to surrender, they sent another fleet toward the Philippines. It's going to take them a while for them to get there, so keep that in mind. Now, as part of those 15,000 troops that showed up, they swung through Guam to accepted surrender, and they get there, and the Spanish governor is like, "I have no idea what you're talking about." He didn't even know that they were at war, so sent over his surrender pretty easily, no fighting there at all. As for Cuba, the Americans started in Guantanamo Bay. Numbers were not slanted in our favor. Spain had about 150,000 regular troops plus 40,000 volunteers, and the US had 26,000 troops. So that went about as well as you can imagine. Basically, so Spain's kind of were kicking our butt there for quite a while, but then the volunteers arrived. That's right! In July, the famous Rough Riders arrived with their fearless leader, Teddy Roosevelt, and suddenly we made all sorts of advances. And now, the Rough Riders can't take total credit for the victory there, but they were a big part of it. And actually, the big battle that you know of there is the Battle of San Juan Hill, and that sort of is what made Teddy Roosevelt a household name at the time. So the Americans lost a lot of men in the battle, but eventually Spain did retreat. So sort of right after that, there was this really big naval battle, which is called the Battle of Santiago de Cuba. And basically, the Americans decimated the Spanish fleet again. And you remember how we talked about earlier that they had sent another fleet to the Philippines because, you know, they were unwilling to surrender. Immediately, that fleet was turned back around because right now the coast in Cuba is completely unguarded, and so they got flipped around. Puerto Rico was then invaded, which is what I was talking about earlier. That's the 125th anniversary tomorrow to what I'm referring to. And again, Spain was super defensive. But eventually in August, the Americans were able to declare victory when the Spanish governor surrendered. So shortly after that, Spain asked for peace before the Americans could go any further. And in December of 1898, they signed a peace treaty, which was called the Treaty of Paris. No, not that Treaty of Paris. Different one. In the treaty, the U.S. gained Cuba, Guam, Puerto Rico, and was allowed to purchase the Philippines for $20 million. In the end, things turned out pretty good for the Americas because of that deal, so much so that the Secretary of State at the time, John Hay, called it a splendid little war. That's not to say that there weren't casualties. Actually, in the end, the war cost the United States $250 million, and 3,000 lives were lost, of whom 90% actually were perished because of infectious diseases, but because they weren't killed by, you know, Spaniards, I guess it just didn't count. So anyway, that's a little bit about the Spanish-American War. I'm highlighting it because of the anniversary, but also because we just have a ton of really cool Spanish-American War stuff in our collection, and I'm really excited to show it to you. I'm going to be explaining some of it this week. There's going to be some links and some videos, so stay tuned. And as always, if you have any questions or comments, I'd love to hear them in the comment section.